The wind was howling like a living creature that night, and the snow was falling so hard it stung my face every time it hit. I stood on the front porch of our Minnesota home, trembling so violently I could barely keep my knees from buckling. My breath came out in thick clouds that were instantly whipped away by the freezing air. My gloved hands were pressed against the locked door, the wood icy under my fingers. Inside, the warm yellow light of the hallway glowed invitingly, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles away. Behind that door, my sister Lila's voice floated out mocking and sweet all at once as she called over her shoulder to my parents. She said something I could not quite make out, followed by the sound of my mother's voice saying clearly, "If you had been nicer to your sister, she wouldn't be doing this." Those words hit harder than the cold. My own mother was not going to open the door. My sister had just locked me outside in the middle of a blizzard, and my parents were siding with her. I banged on the door again, my fists weak from the numbness setting in. Lila laughed from the other side, a sharp sound that seemed to slice through the wind. I could picture her standing there in her favorite sweater sipping hot cocoa while I stood outside with ice forming in my hair. The storm had swallowed the rest of the neighborhood. The street lamps were barely visible through the curtain of snow. The driveway and yard were buried under thick drifts. I felt my toes go from aching to nothing at all, which I knew was a bad sign. I shouted for my dad, but there was no answer. I shouted again and finally heard his footsteps, but instead of the door unlocking, his voice came through it, telling me to apologize to Lila if I wanted to come back in. My chest tightened with both anger and fear. Apologize for what I asked, but no one answered. The cold was starting to slow my thoughts, making everything feel heavy and far away. I remembered hearing on the news how quickly frostbite could set in on nights like this. The idea that my own family would leave me out here until I complied with some twisted idea of respect was almost harder to believe than the fact that my body was starting to shut down. I pounded again on the door, using the last bit of strength in my arms. My vision blurred from the snowflakes whipping into my eyes. I could hear the muffled sounds of the TV, inside the occasional burst of laughter from Lila, the clink of mugs on the kitchen counter. Every sound reminded me of the warmth and safety just beyond my reach and how deliberately they were denying it to me. The pain in my fingers grew sharper for a moment before disappearing into a deep nothingness that terrified me more than the ache had. I pressed my forehead against the door and whispered, "Please," before I realized I was speaking. My mother's voice came again from farther inside, saying, "Leave her. She'll learn her lesson." The words were calm but final. I knew then that no one was coming for me. Something broke inside me in that moment, not just my trust in them, but the last fragile thread of hope that maybe they cared. That night, the snow froze my skin, but it also froze whatever was left of my belief that family meant protection. I turned away from the door, not because I wanted to, but because I understood I might have to save myself if I wanted to see another morning. Our family looked perfect from the outside. The Carters had the two-story white house with green shutters, a well-kept lawn in the summer, and a pristine driveway in the winter. My father, Robert Carter, was the respected branch manager of the local bank. My mother, Susan, taught second grade at the elementary school and always had a smile ready for parents and neighbors. Lila, my older sister, was the shining star of our little town's high school. She was captain of the cheerleading squad homecoming queen last year and the kind of girl who never walked down the hall without being greeted by at least 5 different people. Then there was me, Emily Carter, quiet, bookish, never the center of attention unless it was for getting the highest grade in class or winning an academic competition. My achievements didn't come with banners or pep rallies. They were the kind of things you put on a college application, not the kind of things that made you popular in the school cafeteria. From as early as I can remember, Lila had been my parents' pride and joy. It wasn't just favoritism, it was a hierarchy. She was the queen, and I was expected to be the supporting act. When I was 6, she accidentally spilled orange juice on my school project the morning it was due. Mom said she didn't mean it. When I was 12, she told my best friend that I'd said mean things about her and that friendship ended overnight. Mom said I shouldn't have trusted anyone with secrets. At 15, I saved up for months to buy a dress for a school dance. The day before, I found it in the trash, shredded. Dad said it was probably a misunderstanding. That pattern became the foundation of my life. Lila hurt me. My parents excused her, and I was expected to keep the peace. But recently, things had shifted. I had been working towards something big, the State Scholars Award. Winning it would almost guarantee me a full scholarship to one of the top universities in the country. It was a goal I'd been chasing for years, and in November, I achieved it. I beat out every other senior in our district, including Lila's boyfriend, who had been sure he would win. The local paper even ran a short article about me. People congratulated me in the halls, and for the first time in years, I felt seen. Lila's reaction was swift and icy. At first it was subtle, a sarcastic comment here, a dismissive shrug there, but I could see it building. Every time someone mentioned my award, her jaw tightened. I overheard her telling her friends I had no life and that the award was just for nerds who spend every Friday night alone. I didn't care what she thought. I cared about getting my college application finished, printing my essays, and sending them out on time, which is why the week before Christmas I bundled up and walked through the snow to the town library to use their printer when ours mysteriously stopped working. The sky was already a bruised gray when I started the walk-back wind whipping the snow into my face until my scarf was crusted with ice. When I got to our driveway, the snow was up to my calves. I trudged up to the porch, relief flooding me as I reached for the door. It didn't open. I knocked, then pounded. The door cracked open just enough for Lila's face to appear. She was smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Her hair was perfectly curled, her sweater spotless, and she had a mug of cocoa in her hand. "What's the magic word?" she asked, her voice, sing-song sweet. I told her to move, that it was freezing. She leaned against the frame and said, "You know you've been acting like you're better than everyone lately. Maybe you should spend some time thinking about that." Then she shut the door. I banged harder, shouting her name. When it opened again, it was Mom standing there, arms crossed. "Emily, if you'd just been nicer to your sister, this wouldn't be happening," she said. Her tone was the same one she used with misbehaving students at school. I stared at her in disbelief. "It's a blizzard," I said, my voice shaking. She just said, "Then maybe next time you'll treat Lila with more respect," and closed the door again. The click of the lock felt like a sentence being passed. The cold wrapped around me tighter, the wind pushing against my body, until I felt like I was being shoved backward. Somewhere deep inside, I understood this wasn't about a single fight. This was the life I'd been given, a life where my sister could do anything, and my parents would not only forgive her, but punish me for resisting. The week before Christmas was supposed to be one of the most peaceful times of the year, but that night it became the moment everything in my life shifted. The forecast had been warning for days about the incoming blizzard. People stocked up on groceries and prepared to stay inside for the weekend. I had no choice but to go out that day because my college scholarship application was due at midnight. Our home printer had stopped working mysteriously that morning, the paper jammed with shredded pieces like someone had stuffed it with scraps on purpose. I didn't have time to fight about it. I grabbed my coat, gloves, and boots, then walked the 2 miles to the public library. By the time I was finished printing and binding the essay packet, the sun had begun to sink behind thick clouds, turning the whole sky into a dark steel color. The air stung my cheeks, and the snow was coming down faster. I kept my head down against the wind, imagining the warm living room waiting for me. But when I finally made it home, Lila was already waiting at the door, leaning against the frame with a smirk. She took one look at the folder in my hand and rolled her eyes. "What's that?" "Another nerd trophy," she asked. I told her to move. Her voice turned syrupy sweet as she said, "You know, Emily, it's kind of sad how desperate you are for attention. You think this little paper is going to make you better than me?" I pushed past her, but she stepped outside onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind her. The wind caught her hair and whipped it around her face, but she didn't seem to feel the cold at all. She took a sip from the steaming mug in her hand and let out a long sigh. "I think you should stand out here for a bit," she said. "Cool off." Before I could react, she darted back inside and slammed the door, the lock clicking instantly. I banged on it with my gloved fists. "Lila, open the door." My voice cracked from the cold air burning my throat. The porch light flicked off, plunging me into darkness. I kept pounding until my arms ached. Finally, the door opened a crack. It was my mother this time, her eyes flat and her jaw set. Emily, this is what happens when you provoke your sister, she said. If you had been kinder, she wouldn't be angry. My breath caught in my chest. You're siding with her, I asked. Her lips thinned. I'm not taking sides. I'm telling you that you need to be more careful about how you treat her. Then she shut the door again. The sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was louder than the wind. My feet were already numb, the tingling sensation fading into a frightening emptiness. I pounded again, calling for my father, but when he appeared behind the glass, he just shook his head. His voice was muffled, but I heard him say, "Just apologize and come in." My hands were shaking too much to form a fist. I stood there, snow collecting on my shoulders, my scarf frozen stiff. Time began to warp. I couldn't tell if it had been 10 minutes or an hour. My thoughts came slower, as if the cold was freezing my brain along with my body. In the middle of my foggy panic, I remembered reading about how frostbite set in fastest on fingers, toes, ears, and noses. My gloves were thick but wet, and the damp cold had seeped through. My boots were soaked from trudging through snowdrifts earlier, and now my socks were clinging to my skin like sheets of ice. I looked at the windows glowing from inside and could picture them perfectly, the fire in the fireplace, the smell of cinnamon cocoa, Lila curled up on the couch, my mother reading, my father checking his phone. All of them warm and safe while I stood outside shivering so hard it hurt. A wave of nausea rolled through me and I staggered to the side of the porch, gripping the railing. The wind howled louder, carrying tiny needles of ice that pricked my skin. I wanted to scream, but the air was so cold it burned my lungs. I was about to try the door one more time when I heard Lila's laugh, muffled but distinct. It was the kind of laugh she used when she knew she'd won. That sound hit me harder than the wind. It told me exactly where I stood in this family. It told me that she had the power to lock me out in a deadly storm, and my parents would let her. It told me that no matter what I achieved, no matter how hard I worked, they would never see me the way they saw her. That realization should have broken me, but instead it began to harden something inside. I knew then that if I made it through that night, I would never forget it, and I would never forgive them. The next morning at school, my body still ached from the cold, and my fingers were stiff even though I had kept them wrapped in gloves the entire bus ride. I had managed to get a few hours of restless sleep after finally being let in when my father unlocked the door around midnight, muttering that I should not make this into a big deal. I had not argued, just stumbled to my room and sat on my bed staring at my hands, which were red swollen and sore to the touch. By the time I walked into the building that morning, I thought I could hide it. I kept my gloves on in class and avoided anyone who might notice my slow movements. During second period gym class, Coach Reynolds called roll and glanced at me. "Emily, you are up for warm-ups," she said, but I shook my head and muttered that I wasn't feeling well. Her eyes narrowed slightly. After class, she caught me just as I was heading toward the locker room. "Let me see your hands," she said in a tone that allowed no refusal. I froze, mumbling that they were fine, but she reached forward and gently took one glove off. The skin was mottled red and pale, the tips of my fingers looking almost waxy. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. I stammered something about being outside too long yesterday, and she pressed further. "Outside too long." "In that storm, Emily, this looks serious." She guided me down the hall to the nurse's office. The nurse, Mrs. Hanley, frowned immediately and began examining my hands, asking detailed questions. I could feel my throat tightening as I repeated the lie about staying out too long while shoveling snow. The truth sat like a stone in my chest, but I couldn't imagine telling them that my sister had locked me out and my parents had let it happen. As Mrs. Hanley dabbed at my skin with warm compresses, Coach Reynolds stayed by my side, her arms crossed. "Emily," she said quietly, "I know there's more to this. I've seen you flinch when your sister passes you in the hallway. You don't have to protect anyone." The words made my eyes sting. I shook my head, but my silence said more than I intended. "Mrs. Hanley excused herself and returned with a small camera. "I need to document this for our records," she explained, snapping several close-up shots of my hands. The sound of the shutter seemed to echo in my head, each click a reminder that what had happened to me was real, visible, undeniable. Afterward, Coach told me she wanted to walk me to the principal's office. My heart raced. I didn't want this to become public, but she was firm, saying if someone hurt you, they need to be stopped. In the principal's office, I sat across from Mr. Klein, who listened quietly as Coach described my injuries and her concerns. He asked me directly if anyone had done this to me. I hesitated, twisting the hem of my sweater, and told him I had been outside too long by accident. He exchanged a glance with Coach and leaned forward. Emily, we are mandated reporters. If we believe a student has been harmed, we have to act. Even if you don't want to talk right now, we will make sure someone checks on you. My stomach dropped. I pictured CPS showing up at my house, my parents' fury. Lila's smirk. But I also felt a small flicker of something else, something dangerously close to relief. Maybe for once, someone would see what was happening without me having to scream it into their faces. Coach placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "We'll do this carefully," she said. "You're not alone." That afternoon, as the snow outside began to fall again, I saw her making a phone call in the hallway, her voice low and serious. I knew without being told that she was calling for help, and I wasn't sure yet whether to be afraid or grateful. That evening, the sky was the same dull gray it had been during the blizzard, but now the streets were plowed and the sidewalks salted. I had just settled in my room, trying to keep my hands elevated because the skin still burned when I heard the crunch of tires on our driveway. At first, I thought it was one of Dad's clients stopping by, but then I saw the unfamiliar white sedan with the government license plate. Two people stepped out, both wearing heavy coats against the cold. The woman was in her 50s with sharp eyes and a clipboard tucked under one arm. The man was younger, tall, with a calm, steady presence. They rang the doorbell, and Mom called out from the kitchen for me to get it. When I opened the door, the woman introduced herself as Mrs. Hill from Child Protective Services and her colleague, Officer Davis, from the local police department. Before I could respond, Mom was at my shoulder, smiling that tight, brittle smile she used when she wanted to appear cooperative. "What can we help you with?" she asked, as if they were door-to-door salespeople. Mrs. Hill explained they had received a report concerning possible neglect and injury to a minor and that they needed to speak with me privately. Mom laughed lightly and said there must be a misunderstanding. "Emily is fine. She just stayed outside too long the other day while shoveling snow." The man's eyes met mine, and there was no judgment in them, only quiet encouragement. "That may be, but we would still like to speak with her alone," he said. Mom's smile faltered. I was led to the dining room while they remained in the living room with my parents. The moment the door closed behind us, Mrs. Hill's tone shifted from formal to warm, but firm. "Emily, can you tell us what happened to your hands?" I hesitated, glancing toward the doorway as if my mother's shadow might slip in at any moment. She noticed and reassured me they could ensure I was safe to speak freely. The words tumbled out slowly at first. I told them about the blizzard, the locked door, the hour outside, and sub-zero temperatures. I told them about Lila's face in the doorway and my mother's voice telling me I should have been nicer. Once I started, I couldn't stop. I told them about years of smaller cruelties, the shredded dress, the ruined school project, the way my parents always called it sisterly teasing or family matters. Officer Davis asked gentle questions to clarify details, writing in a small notebook. Mrs. Hill's eyes darkened as the pattern became clear. "Emily, this is not normal sibling rivalry," she said finally. "This is targeted harmful behavior, and your parents have failed to protect you." My hands shook as I nodded, feeling the truth settle heavily, but also like a weight lifting. I had never said it out loud to anyone before. Outside, I could hear raised voices in the living room. My father's deep, controlled tone was becoming tight with anger. My mother's pitch was higher, sharp with indignation. Then came Lila's voice, dripping with outrage and fear. "She's making it up," she yelled. "She's jealous, and she's trying to ruin my life." I could picture her pacing in the kitchen, that perfect hair and perfect posture finally cracking under the pressure. Mrs. Hill stood and said they would need to document my injuries and have a doctor examine me immediately. When we stepped back into the living room, my mother was standing with her arms crossed, her face pale, but her eyes blazing. "Emily, put on your coat," she said. "You are not going anywhere with them." Officer Davis stepped between us, calmly stating that they had legal authority to ensure my safety and that interfering could result in charges. My father's face drained of color. He knew exactly what that meant for his reputation in this small town. Lila looked between them, her mouth opening and closing like she couldn't decide whether to scream or cry. Mrs. Hill motioned me toward the door, and I walked past my family without a word. The cold air hit my face, but this time it didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like the first breath after being underwater too long. As we approached the car, I glanced back just in time to see my mother's hand gripping Lila's arm hard enough to make her flinch, her lips moving rapidly in some furious whisper. It was the first time I had ever seen fear in my sister's eyes, and it told me she understood that this time she might not get away with it. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the hum of the heater filling the space as I sat in the back seat watching the houses and snowy streets slide by. Mrs. Hill finally spoke, turning slightly in her seat to face me. "Emily, you are going to be examined at the urgent care clinic first so we can officially document your injuries," she said. "After that, we will discuss a safe place for you to stay for a while." I nodded, gripping my hands together in my lap, careful not to press too hard on the tender skin. Officer Davis asked if I felt comfortable talking about what might happen next. I told him I just wanted to be somewhere I did not have to watch every word or action in case it upset my sister. He gave a small nod, like he understood more than I was saying. At the clinic, a nurse brought me into a small room and gently unwrapped my hands from the gloves. She winced at the sight of the peeling and blotchy skin. The doctor came in a few minutes later and began asking questions as he examined each finger. He confirmed mild frostbite and said that while I was lucky the damage was not permanent, it would take time to heal. He dictated notes to the nurse, making sure to emphasize that the injury had been caused by prolonged exposure in sub-zero temperatures. Mrs. Hill took photos again this time for the case file. I could feel the reality of it solidifying in those images. It was no longer something my parents could dismiss as an accident. After the appointment, we stepped back into the cold evening and she told me they had contacted a relative who had agreed to take me in temporarily. I was surprised when she said it was my mother's younger sister, Martha. I barely knew her except for the occasional Christmas card. I remembered overhearing once that she had stopped visiting years ago after a fight with my parents. We pulled into a quiet street lined with tall bare trees. Martha's small house had warm light spilling from the windows and a wreath on the door. She opened it before we could knock. "Emily," she said with a voice full of concern, and pulled me into a hug before I could react. "Come inside, it is freezing." The smell of something baking wrapped around me as I stepped in. Mrs. Hill explained the situation briefly while Martha listened with a grim expression. She assured them I would have my own room and that she would make sure I was safe. Once they left, I stood awkwardly in the hallway, unsure what to do. Martha smiled gently and told me to sit at the kitchen table. She placed a mug of hot tea in front of me and said, "I want you to know you are welcome here for as long as you need. I will not let anyone treat you like that again." The sincerity in her voice cracked something in me. I felt tears sliding down my face before I could stop them. She didn't rush me or ask for more details. She just sat with me until I was ready to eat the soup she had kept warm on the stove. That night in the small guest room under a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender, I stared at the ceiling and thought about how quickly everything had changed. In one day, I had gone from being trapped in a house where I had no voice to being somewhere I could breathe. It was terrifying and relieving all at once, and I knew the hardest part was still ahead because sooner or later I would have to face my parents again. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains of the guest room, casting a golden glow across the quilt. For a moment, I lay still, letting the quiet sink in. No slamming doors, no raised voices, no sarcastic remarks from Lila drifting down the hallway. Just the hum of the furnace and the faint clink of dishes from the kitchen. When I walked in, Martha was already at the table with a cup of coffee and the local paper folded beside her. She smiled and slid a plate of scrambled eggs toward me. "Eat," she said, "you have a long day ahead." I asked what she meant, and she explained that Mrs. Hill would be stopping by to go over next steps for my case and also to check on my hands. I flexed my fingers gingerly, still feeling the stiffness, but relieved that the burning had eased. As I ate, Martha began talking about her own history with my mother. She told me how she had left town years ago after realizing that my mother had always tried to control her life decisions from who she dated to where she worked. "I guess that kind of control runs in the family," she said softly, and I understood she was giving me permission to see the patterns for what they were. By mid-morning, Mrs. Hill arrived with a folder thick with notes. She sat across from me and explained that because of the documented history of favoritism and the severity of this latest incident, CPS was opening a formal case. My parents would be required to attend counseling and parenting classes, while Lila would undergo a psychological evaluation. I asked if I had to go back home, and she said not unless a judge determined it was safe, which, given the evidence, was unlikely in the near future. Relief washed over me, but it was quickly followed by determination. I told her I wanted to focus on finishing my college applications, and she promised they would arrange whatever I needed, including access to my school files and a laptop. Later that afternoon, I sat at Martha's dining table with my essay spread out before me, polishing every sentence. Without the constant tension of my parents' house, the words came easier. I could think clearly. I sent off the final application that evening, my heart pounding as I hit submit. It felt like planting a flag in the ground, a quiet declaration that I was moving forward on my own terms. 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived in Martha's mailbox with my name typed neatly on the front. I stood in the kitchen holding it for a moment, afraid to open it as if the weight of my future was inside. Martha urged me on, and I tore it open to see the letterhead from one of the top universities in the country. My eyes scanned the page until the words "full scholarship offer" leapt out at me. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Then the joy hit me all at once, and I laughed a sound I hadn't heard from myself in a long time. Martha hugged me tightly, telling me she knew I could do it. I called Coach Reynolds immediately, and she shouted congratulations so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. The news spread quickly at school, and friends began texting me saying how proud they were. Even some teachers I hadn't spoken to much stopped me in the hall to congratulate me. That afternoon, an email arrived from my parents. The subject line was simply, "We're proud of you." The message inside was longer, full of compliments on my determination and achievements, and ending with an invitation to come home for a celebratory dinner. I stared at the screen for a long time, reading their words over and over. It sounded almost genuine, but I could still hear my mother's voice from that night telling me I should have been nicer to Lila. I typed a short reply, thanking them for the message, but saying I wasn't ready to visit. A few hours later, Lila sent me a text dripping with sarcasm about how I thought I was too good for the family now. I didn't respond. For the first time, ignoring her didn't feel like defeat. It felt like control. That evening, Martha made a special dinner just for the two of us, and we ate by the fire while snow fell softly outside. I thought about how far I had come from the night I stood shivering on that porch, and how this scholarship wasn't just an opportunity, it was proof that I had managed to rise above everything they tried to keep me under. 6 months later, I stood on a stage under bright lights looking out at an audience that filled the auditorium. The applause was loud and warm as I accepted the award for Outstanding Student Achievement at my high school's year-end ceremony. My hands no longer ached, though faint marks remained on the skin, quiet reminders of what I had survived. I took a deep breath and began my speech talking about perseverance, about the importance of speaking up even when your voice shakes, and about how success is not just about what you achieve, but what you overcome to get there. I didn't mention names, but I spoke of nights when the cold felt endless and days when silence seemed safer than the truth. I saw Martha in the front row wiping at her eyes and Coach Reynolds smiling proudly. Somewhere behind them, I noticed Mrs. Hill and Officer Davis, who had come to see me receive the award. After the ceremony, several students approached me quietly to say they had been inspired by my words. 2 of them told me they were dealing with problems at home and were thinking about reaching out for help. I realized then that my story wasn't just mine anymore, it could be a push for someone else to stand up. The next day, an email came from the university inviting me to join an early summer program for incoming scholarship students. It was a chance to start fresh in a new place months before the official term began. I accepted without hesitation. Packing my things at Martha's felt different from the times I had packed at my parents' house. There was no heaviness in my chest, no dread, only excitement. On my last night in town, Martha hosted a small gathering with friends and teachers who had supported me. As I looked around the room, I realized this was what a real family looked like, people who cared because they wanted to, not because they had to. The morning I left for the university summer program, the air was warm and clear, the first true sign of summer. Martha drove me to the bus station, her hand resting on the steering wheel, but her eyes glancing toward me every few moments as if to make sure I was really okay. I was. I had 2 suitcases filled with clothes books and the laptop she had bought me as a gift when I finished my applications. As we waited for the bus, she told me she was proud of me not just for the scholarship, but for surviving everything that had been thrown at me. I thanked her and promised to visit during breaks. When the bus pulled away, I watched her in the rearview mirror until she was just a small figure on the platform. The ride to the city where the university was felt like crossing into a new chapter of my life. The campus was beautiful with green lawns and old brick buildings. My dorm room was small but bright, and my roommate was friendly and curious about my story, though I kept the details private for now. Classes started quickly, and I threw myself into them with an energy I hadn't felt in years. Every project and presentation felt like a step toward the future I had claimed for myself. One evening after a workshop, I got an unexpected email from my parents. They had seen a photo of me in the local paper taken during the award ceremony and wrote that they were sorry for everything that they had been wrong and that they wanted to try to rebuild our relationship. I stared at the message for a long time before closing it without replying. Forgiveness, I realized, was not something I owed them, and my healing did not depend on their approval. A few weeks later, during a call with Martha, she told me that Lila had been ordered to continue counseling and community service, and that my parents had been attending mandatory parenting classes. I felt no satisfaction in hearing it, only a quiet sense that the cycle was finally broken for me. As summer turned to fall, I stood in the campus library one evening, looking out at the sunset, and thought about that night in the blizzard. It had almost taken me, but it had also given me something I had never known before: the certainty that I could survive and even thrive without the people who were supposed to protect me. My life was no longer defined by their cruelty or their control. It was mine now, and I was determined to make it something worth every step it had taken to get here.